Section 28 of the Shakespeare Storybook. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jason in Panama. The Shakespeare Storybook by Mary Macleod. Romeo and Juliet, Part 2, Mercutio. When the ball was over, Romeo's friends Mercutio and Benvolio looked for him to return with them, but Romeo was nowhere to be found. Unable to leave the neighbourhood of the lady who had so suddenly taken possession of his heart, Romeo had scaled the wall of Capulet's orchard. As he drew near the house, a window above opened, and Juliet herself stepped out onto a balcony. Romeo was hidden among the shadows of the trees, but the silver rays of a summer moon shone full on Juliet, and lighted up her sweet young face and her ball dress of shimmering white satin. Like Romeo, Juliet was sad at heart, for all her thoughts were running on the gallant young stranger, and it grieved her to remember that he was the son of her father's enemy. Believing herself to be alone, Juliet spoke her meditations aloud, and in the silence of the night they were clearly heard by the unseen listener below. "O Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo?" she sighed. "Deny thy father, and refuse thy name. Or, if thou wilt not, only swear to love me, and I'll no longer be a Capulet." "Shall I hear more, or shall I speak at this?" said Romeo to himself, enraptured at hearing such words. "It is only thy name that is my enemy," continued Juliet. "What's Montague? It is not hand, nor foot, nor arm, nor face, nor any other part belonging to a man. Oh, be some other name! What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. Romeo, doff thy name, and for that name, which is no part of thee, take all myself." "I take thee at thy word," cried Romeo, unable to keep silence any longer. "Call me but Love, and I will be new baptized. Henceforth I never will be Romeo." Juliet was greatly startled to find that her rash words had been overheard, but she soon recognised the voice to be that of Romeo. She warned him of the peril he ran if he should be discovered, but Romeo cared little for the swords of her kinsmen, provided that he won the love of the lady. It was too late now to deny what she had so frankly confessed, and the darkness of the night hid Juliet's blushes. She therefore took courage and spoke out candidly, saying that if Romeo really loved her, let him pronounce it faithfully, and though he might think she was too easily won, yet she would prove more true than many who had more cunning in feigning coldness. Romeo was all fire and eagerness, and was beginning to swear his unswerving constancy when Juliet checked him. Her heart was still troubled, and, though she rejoiced to find that Romeo loved her, she could scarcely rejoice in the contract they had made. It seemed too rash, too unadvised, too sudden, to last. But if Romeo's purpose still held, and he wished to marry her, Juliet bade him send word the next day by a trusty messenger, where and at what time the ceremony should be performed, and she would lay all her fortune at his feet, and follow him, her husband, throughout the world. In this sudden emergency Romeo knew whom to apply. There was a good old man, called Friar Laurence, a friend of both the families, who was much grieved at the bitter dissension between them, and had many times tried to induce them to become reconciled. Friar Laurence had often chided Romeo for his extravagant doting on Rosaline, and his unstrained grief because she would not listen to him. The good man was somewhat astonished at this sudden turn of events. He foresaw that one of Romeo's passionate, excitable nature was never likely to be happy. The hot-headed young man was always in extremes, either in a state of rapture or in the depths of despair. He would listen to no counsel, and never paused to reflect. But when Friar Laurence on this occasion understood what was wanted of him, he did not refuse his aid, for he thought this alliance might prove so happy that it would turn the rancour of the two households into peace and love. So word was sent to Juliet, and, with the connivance of her old nurse, who was fully in the confidence of the two young lovers, Juliet stole away the next morning to Friar Lawrence's cell, and was there secretly married to Romeo. On this same morning of the marriage it happened that Romeo's friends, Mercutio and Benvolio, were walking through Verona. It was a very hot day, and Benvolio presently suggested they should go home, saying that the Capulets were abroad, and that if they met, they would certainly not escape a brawl, for these hot days fevered the blood, and made men quarrelsome. Mercutio laughed at Benvolio's caution, and accused him of being as hot-tempered a man as any in Italy. "Nay, if there were two such we would have none shortly, for one would kill the other," he said jeeringly. Why thou wilt quarrel with a man that hath a hair more or a hair less in his beard than thou hast. Thou wilt quarrel with a man for cracking nuts, having no other reason but because thou hast hazel eyes. Thy head is as full of quarrels as an egg is full of meat. Thou hast quarrelled with a man for coughing in the street, because he hath wakened thy dog that hath lain asleep in the sun. Didst thou not fall out with a tailor for wearing his new doublet before Easter, and with another for tying his new shoes with old riband? And yet thou wilt tutor me from quarrelling?" "If I were as ready to quarrel as thou art," retorted Benvolio, "any man should buy the fee simple of my life for an hour and a quarter." It will easily be seen that these gentlemen were not in the most amiable frame of mind, and it was unfortunate that at that moment a party of the Capulets should come up, among them being the fiery tempered nephew of Lady Capulet. The incident of the night before still rankled in Tybalt's mind, and any friend of Romeo's was fit subject on which to wreak his spite. But Mercutio was not a man to brook insult, and he returned Tybalt's insolence with interest. "Gentlemen, good day. A word with one of you," said Tybalt, advancing. "Only one word with one of us?" said Mercutio in a mocking voice. "Couple it with something. Make it a word and a blow." "You shall find me apt enough at that, sir, if you give me occasion," said Tybalt, glaring at him. "Could you not take some occasion without giving?" sneered Mercutio. "Mercutio, thou consortest with Romeo." "Consort!" echoed Mercutio. "What, do you make us minstrels? If you make minstrels of us, look to hear nothing but discords. Here's my fiddlestick. Here's that which shall make you dance," and he laid his hand threateningly on his sword. "We talk here in the public haunt of men," interposed Benvolio, for their wrangling had begun to attract the attention of two or three inquisitive passers by. "Either withdraw to some private place, and talk over your grievances calmly, or else depart. Here all eyes gaze on us." "Men's eyes were made to look, and let them gaze," said Mercutio coolly. "I will not budge for any man's pleasure, I." "Well, peace be with you, sir. Here comes my man," said Tybalt, for he saw Romeo approaching. "But I'll be hanged, sir, if he wears your livery," said Mercutio. Straight from his marriage with Juliet, his heart full of joy, and his spirit breathing peace to all mankind, came Romeo. Even the insult with which Tybalt greeted him did not at such a moment rouse his anger. Tybalt was Juliet's kinsman. In his overflowing love for Juliet, Romeo could not quarrel with one who might be dear to her. "Romeo, the hate I bear thee can afford no better term than this. Thou art a villain," said Tybalt. "Tybalt," returned Romeo mildly, "the reason I have for loving you prevents the rage which should follow such a greeting. I am no villain. Therefore, farewell. I see you do not know me." "Boy, this shall not excuse the injuries you have done me. Therefore, turn and draw." "I do protest, I never injured you, but love you better than you can guess, till you shall know the reason of my love. And so, good Capulet, which name I speak as dearly as my own, be satisfied." Mercutio had listened in amazement to Romeo's gentle responses to Tybalt's insults, but at this he could constrain himself no further. "O calm, dishonourable, vile submission!" he cried in wrath, and drew his sword. "Tybalt, you rat catcher, will you walk?" What would you have with me?" "Good King of Cats, nothing but one of your 9 lives. Will you pluck out your sword? Make haste, lest mine be about your ears before it be out." "I am for you," said Tybalt, drawing. "Gentle Mercutio, put your rapier up," entreated Romeo. "Come, sir, begin," was Mercutio's only answer. "Draw, Benvolio, beat down their weapons," cried Romeo imploringly. "Gentlemen, for shame, forbear this outrage. Tybalt, Mercutio, the Prince has expressly forbidden fighting in the streets of Verona. Hold, Tybalt! Good Mercutio!" In his eagerness to stay the combatants, Romeo tried to strike up their weapons, and Tybalt, seizing his advantage, stabbed Mercutio under Romeo's arm. Then, seeing him reel back into Benvolio's arms, Tybalt fled with his followers. "I am hurt," said Mercutio. "A plague on both your houses! I am done for. Is he gone, and hath nothing?" "What, are you hurt?" said Benvolio. "Ay, ay, a scratch, a scratch," said Mercutio, with an attempt at his old light manner. "Marry, it's enough. Where is my page? Go, villain, fetch a surgeon." "Courage, man, the hurt cannot be much," said Romeo tenderly. "No, it's not so deep as a well, nor so wide as a church door," said Mercutio in his usual jesting style, though he could only gasp out the words with difficulty. "But it's enough. It will serve. Ask for me to morrow, and you shall find me a grave man. I am peppered, I warrant, for this world. A plague on both your houses! Why the devil did you come between us? I was hurt under your arm." "I thought all for the best," said poor Romeo. "Help me into some house, Benvolio, or I shall faint," gasped Mercutio. "A plague on both your houses! They have made worms' meat of me. Your houses." Benvolio supported Mercutio away, but returned in a few minutes with the mournful tidings that the brave and gallant spirit had taken flight. Mercutio, the brilliant wit, the loyal friend, the light-hearted comrade, had fallen a victim to the dissension between the houses of Montague and Capulet. Jealous of his friend's honour as of his own, he had risked all in its defence, and he had faced death, as he had done life, with undaunted bearing and a smile on his lips. Benvolio had scarcely told the news when back came Tybalt, and furious at the loss of his friend, Romeo hurled aside all thoughts of leniency, and straightway sprang at his murderer. The fight was brief, and Tybalt fell. Romeo was hastily hurried off by Benvolio, for the whole town was now in an uproar, and he knew that, if taken, Romeo would probably be doomed to death. Dazed by all the calamities which had suddenly fallen on him, Romeo let himself be persuaded, and departed, almost in a dream. The Prince of Verona now arrived, also Capulet and Montague, and crowds of other citizens. In reply to the Prince's inquiries, Benvolio gave an account of what had happened, telling the story in the most favourable light he could for the absent Romeo, whose fault, indeed, it had no wise been. He told how Tybalt had provoked him, and how Romeo had tried to keep the peace, reminding the quarrelsome nobleman of the Prince's displeasure; also how Tybalt had slain Mercutio when Romeo was trying to stop the duel, and how, after Mercutio's death, Tybalt had come back and fought with Romeo. Before Benvolio could part them, Tybalt was slain, and now Romeo had fled. The Capulets began to clamour for revenge. Benvolio, they said, was a kinsman to the Montagues, and his affection made him speak falsely. The matter was not as he described it. They begged for justice. Romeo had slain Tybalt. Romeo must die. "Romeo slew him, he slew Mercutio," said the Prince, grieving for the loss of his own kinsman. "Who owes the Prince for Mercutio's dear blood?" "Not Romeo, Prince, he was Mercutio's friend," said Montague. "His fault only concludes what the law should have ended, the life of Tybalt." "And for that offence we exile him immediately," pronounced the Prince, determined by severe measures to put a stop to the incessant brawling that was bringing sorrow to so many noble families. "I have suffered because of your hate. My dear kinsman is slain. But I will punish you with so heavy a fine that you shall repent my loss. I will be deaf to pleading and excuses; neither tears nor prayers shall soften this sentence. therefore use none. Let Romeo leave the city at once, else when he is found, that hour shall be his last. Mercy only encourages murder when it pardons those who kill. End of Section 28. Section 29 of the Shakespeare Storybook. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jason in Panama. The Shakespeare Storybook by Mary Macleod. Romeo and Juliet, Part 3. Banished. Comfort and Counsel. When Juliet hastened to Friar Lawrence's cell to be married to Romeo, her nurse went off in another direction, to secure a ladder of cords, so that the young husband might visit his wife that evening, and speak to her with less danger of discovery than if she were up in the balcony and he below in the orchard. This nurse of Juliet's was a talkative, easy-tempered old person, very fond of her nursling, of whom she had had charge since she was a baby, and good-natured after a fashion, but vulgar-minded, and very selfish if anything came to cross her own convenience. Juliet had coaxed her into sympathy about her present affairs, and Romeo being a very handsome, open-handed young gentleman, the nurse for the moment was on their side, and consented to act as messenger between them. But her own aches and pains were at all times more important to the old woman than the concerns of anyone else, and even when returning from her mission to settle the time of the marriage, she was more occupied in recounting her own ailments than in relieving the anxiety of her young mistress to hear news of Romeo. However, as long as things went well, she was willing to be amiable, and the young girl was at least not left entirely destitute of any confidant. But when trouble arose, the nurse's shallow, selfish nature became apparent, and poor Juliet was soon to learn that she must rely solely on her own strength and judgment in the sorrows that overwhelmed her. After the marriage Juliet returned home, and there presently the nurse joined her. She carried the ladder of cords she had gone to fetch, but she flung it down with a gesture of despair, and her face was the picture of woe. "Ay me, what news? Why do you wring your hands?" exclaimed Juliet, a sudden chill of terror clouding the sunshine of her joy. "Ah, well a day! He's dead! He's dead! He's dead!" wailed the nurse. "We are undone, lady, we are undone! Alack the day! He's gone! He's killed! He's dead!" Juliet thought, of course, that the nurse referred to Romeo, especially when she went on weeping and wailing, and saying that she had seen him lying dead with her own eyes. Juliet's heart was nearly broken at the dreadful news, when suddenly the stupid old woman in her confused style began to lament. "O Tybalt, Tybalt, the best friend I had! O courteous Tybalt, honest gentleman, that ever I should live to see thee dead!" "What do you mean?" said poor bewildered Juliet. "Is Romeo slaughtered, and is Tybalt dead? My dear loved cousin and my dearer lord?" "Tybalt is gone, and Romeo banished," said the nurse. "Romeo that killed him, he is banished." Her words were plain enough now. Juliet shrank back in horror. Did Romeo's hand shed Tybalt's blood? It did! It did! Alas the day, it did! Juliet's first impulse was to heap reproaches on her newly made husband, who hid so vile a nature under so fair a seeming, but when the nurse chimed eagerly in, and said that there was no trust, no faith, no honesty in man, they were all perjured, all dissemblers, Juliet immediately changed her tone, and broke into an indignant defence of Romeo. "Will you speak well of him that killed your cousin?" asked the nurse. "Shall I speak ill of him that is my husband?" cried Juliet. "Ah, poor my lord, what tongue shall smooth thy name when I, thy 3 hours' wife, have wronged it?" Worse, far worse to her than her cousin's death was the terrible news that Romeo was banished. "Tybalt is dead, and Romeo banished!" The dreadful words kept ringing in her ears. "Romeo is banished! There is no end, no limit, measure, bound in that word's death. No words can fathom that woe," she mourned. Juliet bade the nurse carry away the ladder of cords, for it was of no use now. Romeo was exiled; she would never see him again. Death, and not Romeo, would be her husband. The old woman was melted to pity at the sight of Juliet's misery. "Go to your room," she said soothingly. "I'll find Romeo to comfort you. I know well where he is. Hark ye, your Romeo will be here at night. I'll go to him. He is hidden in Friar Lawrence's cell." "Oh, find him, give this ring to my true knight," cried Juliet, "and bid him come to take his last farewell." Forced to find a refuge after the death of Tybalt, Romeo had gone to the man who had always been a friend to him, and the good Friar Lawrence had given him shelter in his cell. He then sallied forth to learn how matters were going, and presently returned with the news of the doom that the Prince had pronounced. Romeo was banished. Romeo was in despair when he heard the sentence. To him, banishment seemed worse than death. In vain the Friar tried to comfort him, pointing out that the sentence was more merciful than what he had a right to expect. Romeo declared it was torture, and not mercy. Heaven was here where Juliet lived, and henceforth every cat and dog and little mouse and unworthy thing might look at her, but he might not. Every creature was free, but he was banished. Was there no poison, no sharp knife, no sudden way of death, however mean, that might have killed him, that he must live on in torture, with that word, banished? The good Friar tried to reason with him, but for the moment Romeo was past all reason. He refused to listen to any words of counsel, and flung himself down on the ground in a perfect frenzy of grief. At that moment there came a knocking at the outside door. "Arise, some one is knocking. Good Romeo, hide thyself," entreated the Friar. But Romeo refused to stir. The knocking came again, louder and more imperative. "Hark, how they knock! Who's there? Romeo, arise, thou wilt be taken. Stay awhile. Stand up. Run to my study. In a minute. Heavens, what folly is this? I come! I come!" The Friar's entreaties to Romeo were mixed with broken ejaculations to the person knocking outside, but as the headstrong young man refused to move from the spot where he had flung himself down on the floor of the cell, Friar Lawrence dared no longer delay to open the door. Happily the newcomer was only Juliet's nurse, and no dangerous or inquisitive visitor. Romeo eagerly demanded news, and then in a fresh passion of remorse at the misery he had brought on his dear lady, threatened madly to kill himself, and drew his sword. The Friar stayed his hand, and now began sternly to rebuke him for his frantic behaviour and unmanly lack of all self-control. Then he pointed out that he still had many blessings left to him, though he chose sullenly to ignore them. Juliet still lived; he was happy in that. The law that might have condemned him to death had it turned into exile; he was happy in that. Finally, the Friar bade him go to Juliet as had been arranged, and comfort her. "But take care not to stay till the watch be set," he counselled, "for then you cannot pass to Mantua, where you shall live till we can find a time to publish your marriage, reconcile your friends, beg pardon of the Prince, and call you back, with 20,000 times more joy than you went forth in lamentation." Romeo was greatly cheered by the brave words of the Friar, and the nurse hurried back to Juliet with the news that her husband would soon be with her. Comfort and counsel. The second parting of Romeo and Juliet at the balcony looking into Capulet's orchard was very different from the first. Then indeed Romeo had reluctantly torn himself away, but, after all, they had another happier meeting to look forward to on the morrow. Now all was gloom and uncertainty, and who knew when they would ever see each other again? The lark, the herald of the morning, that sang joyously high overhead, the golden rays of dawn that pierced the eastern clouds, only brought sadness to the hearts of the young husband and wife, for they told that the fatal hour of parting had come. Longing to keep Romeo with her, yet dreading the peril he ran if he delayed too long, Juliet one moment implored him to stay, and the next urged him to depart. "Oh, now be gone! More light and light it grows," she sighed at last, and Romeo echoed despairingly, "More light and light, more dark and dark our woes." At this moment the nurse came hastily to warn Juliet that her mother was approaching, and now indeed Romeo must take his last farewell. As Juliet looked down to him from the balcony it seemed to her that Romeo's face, in the grey light of dawn, looked pale as one in the bottom of a tomb, and even his cheering words that spoke of a future meeting failed to bring comfort to her breaking heart. But she had no time to brood over this sorrow, for she was now called to face another and almost more terrible trial. Lady Capulet had come to her daughter's room at this unusual hour to bring news of great importance. The County Paris had renewed his suit to Juliet's father. All was arranged, the marriage was fixed to take place in 3 days' time, on the following Thursday. It did not occur to the parents that Juliet would have any voice in the matter, or rather Lady Capulet thought it would be joyful tidings to her, and would help to console her for the death of her cousin Tybalt. She was, therefore, somewhat astonished to find the way in which her news was received. In answer to her intelligence that early next Thursday the gallant young and noble gentleman, the County Paris, at St. Peter's Church, would happily make Juliet a joyful bride, her daughter exclaimed with fire, "Now, by St. Peter's Church and Peter too, he shall not make me there a joyful bride." Juliet went on to say that she would not marry in this haste, and when she did marry it would be Romeo, their enemy, rather than Paris. Then in came Capulet, her father, and, deaf to all Juliet's pleadings, he swore in a furious rage that she should marry Paris, and if she did not, she might beg, starve, die in the streets, for he would not own her as a daughter. Juliet appealed to her mother, but Lady Capulet was really angry with her, or perhaps she did not dare go against her husband. At any rate, she took his side in the matter, and harshly refused to listen to anything Juliet might say. "Do as thou wilt, for I have done with thee," were her final cruel words, as she followed her husband from the room. Cut to the heart, stunned with misery, Juliet turned to her last hope. Her old nurse was still beside her. She, at least, knew that what her parents demanded was impossible. She knew that Juliet could not marry Paris, for she was already married to Romeo. Perhaps she could suggest some way of escape. "Comfort me, counsel me," implored the distracted young girl. "What say'st thou? Hast thou not a word of joy? Some comfort, nurse." And this is the comfort and counsel the old nurse gave. Romeo was banished, she said, and would wager anything he would never dare to come back to challenge her, or, if he did, it would have to be by stealth. Then, since the case stood as it did, she thought the best thing would be for Juliet to marry the County Paris. Oh, he was a lovely gentleman. Romeo was nothing to him. Indeed, she thought Juliet very happy in her second match, for it far excelled her first, or, if it did not, her first was dead, or he might just as well be dead as living when banished from Juliet. So spoke the selfish, base-minded old woman. Juliet looked at her fixedly. "Do you speak this from your heart?" she asked solemnly. "And from my soul too," returned the old woman, "or evil befall them." "Amen," said Juliet. "What?" "Well, you have comforted me marvellous much," said Juliet, speaking with strange calm. "Go in and tell my lady that, having displeased my father, I have gone to Friar Laurence's cell to make confession and to be absolved." "Marry, I will, and this is wisely done," said the old nurse, pottering away to fulfil her errand. Then, for a moment, Juliet's self-restraint gave way. "O most wicked fiend!" she cried, in just indignation, "is it more sin to wish me to be thus forsworn, or to dispraise my lord with that same tongue with which she has praised him as above compare so many thousand times? Go, counsellor, thou and my bosom henceforth shall be twain. I will go to the friar to ask his remedy. If everything else fail, I have power myself to die." The good friar did not fail the young girl in her need, as the old nurse had done. But the way of escape he suggested was such a terrible one that none but the bravest and most faithful heart could ever have consented to it. Juliet's position, however, was so desperate, and she was so determined to be true to Romeo, that she would have died rather than have married Paris, and now she declared she was ready to go down to the gates of death itself, if only she might live a true wife to Romeo. Seeing her resolution, Friar Laurence went on to describe his plan. The marriage was to take place 2 days hence, on the Thursday. On the Wednesday night Juliet, when she went to bed, was to drink off the contents of a phial, which the friar would give her. This was a very strong sleeping draught, which would make her lie exactly like dead, pale as ashes, stiff and cold, for 42 hours, after which she would awaken as if from a pleasant sleep. On the Thursday morning, when they came to rouse her for the marriage, they would find her apparently dead, and then, according to the custom of the country, in her best robes, uncovered on the bier, she would be borne to the ancient vault of the Capulets. In the meantime, before she woke, news would be sent to Romeo to tell him everything. He would come back to Verona, and he and Friar Lawrence would watch beside Juliet in the vault until she awoke, and that very same night Romeo should convey her away to Mantua. This was the desperate plan which the friar suggested, and which Juliet's love for her husband gave her strength to accept and carry out. With unflinching courage she seized the little phial, while Friar Lawrence went immediately to dispatch a speedy messenger to Mantua with letters to Romeo. All through the night before the marriage there was bustle and stir in the household of the Capulets. Great preparations were being made for the festivities, and Capulet himself was up all night, urging forward the servants, and hurrying them here and there about their different tasks. As the moments sped by he became more and more excited, and when the musicians arrived to serenade the bride on her wedding morning, he shouted to the nurse to go and waken Juliet at once, and get her dressed. "Hi, make haste," he said, "I'll go and chat with Paris. Make haste, make haste! The bridegroom, he is come already. Make haste, I say!" So the nurse went to Juliet's chamber. How calm and restful was everything here! Not a contrast to the rush and noisy confusion outside the closed door. Not a sound broke the stillness, not a rustle of movement showed that any living creature was an inmate of the room. Behind those drawn curtains the bride slept well. But she must rouse herself now, the time for slumber is past. She must shake off the heaviness from her dreaming eyes, she must leave this peaceful haven of her childhood. Her happy girlish days are over and done with. The wedding feast is set, the guests are assembling, the bridegroom is waiting. Wake, Juliet, awaken! Shout, nurse, wail for sorrow, and wring your hands. Call louder, the bride does not hear you. Weep, mother, for the child whom you turned from when living. Mourn, father, for the daughter you rejected and disowned. There in her bridal robes lies the bride upon her bed, pale as ashes, stiff and cold. The snowy whiteness of her wedding raiment is not more white than her face. Her closed eyes smile back no greeting to the rising sun. The little phial has done its work. Here at the door stands the bridegroom, but to the mourners in that desolate chamber it seems that a mightier than he has stepped before him and claimed the bride, and the name of that bridegroom is Death. End of section 29. Section 30 of the Shakespeare Storybook. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jason in Panama. The Shakespeare Storybook by Mary Macleod. Romeo and Juliet, Part 4. The Palace of Dim Night. Friar Lawrence had done his best for the young lovers, and he carried out his scheme with speed and vigilance. But an unfortunate accident prevented the letters he wrote to Romeo ever reaching their destination. The friar to whom he entrusted them went to find a brother friar of their order to go with him. This man was occupied in visiting the sick. The plague was then raging in Verona, and the searchers of the town, finding Friar John and his companion, and suspecting they were both in a house where the pestilence was, sealed up the doors, and refused to let them forth. Thus Friar John never got to Mantua at all, and he was even unable to forward the letter to Romeo or to return it to Friar Lawrence, so fearful was everyone of infection. On his release, 2 days later, he hurried back to the cell of Friar Lawrence, and the latter learnt with dismay how his plan had failed. There was only one thing to be done. He must go to the vault alone, to be there when Juliet awakened, for in 3 hours' time the power of the sleeping potion would be exhausted. Though Friar Lawrence's message never got to Romeo, other tidings of sadder import reached him. When Romeo had started for Mantua he left his servant Balthazar to follow him later with all news. Balthasar, of course, like all Verona, had heard of the tragedy at the Capulets' house, and never doubted the truth of Juliet's death. At the moment he reached Mantua, it happened that Romeo was in the highest spirits; an unaccustomed lightness of heart seemed that day to have taken possession of him. As he strolled through the streets of Mantua just before Balthasar's arrival, Romeo was musing happily over a dream of good omen that he had had the night before. "My dream foretells some joyful news at hand," he thought. "I dreamt my lady came and found me dead strange dream that gives a dead man leave to think and breathed such life with kisses on my lips that I revived, and was an emperor. Ah me, how sweet is love itself, when but love's shadows are so rich in joy!" At that moment Balthasar appeared, just as he had come off his journey. Romeo's heart leapt up anew at the sight of him. "News from Verona!" he cried. "How now, Balthasar? Do you not bring me letters from the Friar? How doth my lady? Is my father well? How fares my Juliet? I ask that again, for nothing can be ill if she be well." Balthasar bowed his head and spoke sadly and solemnly. "Then she is well, and nothing can be ill. Her body sleeps in Capulet's monument, and her immortal part with angels lives. I saw her laid low in her kindred's vault, and took post at once to tell it you. Oh, pardon me for bringing this ill news, since you left it for my office, sir." Stunned by the blow, Romeo made no loud outcry. Those who are stricken to the heart have no power to bewail their misery. "Is it even so? Then I defy you, stars," was all he said when he heard of the fatal tidings. The boyish turbulence, the violent outpourings of grief, the noisy despair that had followed his former woes found no voice in his present calamity. His was the calmness of one who knows that for him all hope is over. "You know my lodging. Get me ink and paper," he said to Balthasar, "and hire post horses. I will hence to night." "I do beseech you, sir, have patience," said the serving man. "Your looks are wild and pale, and import some misadventure." "Tush! You are deceived," said Romeo. "Leave me, and do the thing I bid you do. Have you no letters to me from the Friar?" "No, my good lord." "No matter. Get you gone, and hire those horses. I'll be with you directly." Romeo's resolution was taken. Juliet was dead. Well, he would die too. Now for the means. Then Romeo remembered that near the very spot where he was standing dwelt an old apothecary, a meagre wretch wasted with misery and famine, whose sordid little shop contained a few musty odds and ends of rubbish, thinly scattered to make up a show. Noting his penury when he had first seen him, Romeo had said to himself, "Now, if a man needed a poison whose sale would be instant death in Mantua, here lives a caitiff wretch who would sell it to him." That thought had only been the forerunner of his present need, and now he found that, won over by the handsome bribe offered, the starving apothecary could indeed supply him with a fatal drug of deadly power. The hour of awakening had not yet come, and Juliet still slept peacefully in her strange abode of death. To the churchyard at night came the gallant County Paris, to lay flowers at the tomb of the young bride who had been so untimely snatched away. His little page kept watch at a distance, while Paris laid the flowers with loving words at the door of the tomb. "Sweet flower with flowers thy bridal bed I strew, O woe, thy canopy is dust and stones. With which sweet water nightly I will dew, or, wanting that, with tears distilled by moans, the obsequies that I for thee will keep, nightly shall be to strew thy grave and weep." Warned by a whistle from the page, Paris retired into the shadow, as other footsteps were heard approaching. Romeo, accompanied by Balthasar, bearing a torch and some tools for opening the vault, now came near, and Paris could hear the instructions Romeo gave his servant. "Give me the mattock and the wrenching iron. Hold, take this letter. Early in the morning see you deliver it to my lord and father. Give me the light. I charge you on your life, whatever you hear or see, stand quite aloof, and do not interrupt me in what I am doing. The reason I descend into this abode of death is partly to behold my lady's face, but chiefly to take from her dead finger a precious ring. Therefore hence, begone. But if you jealously return to pry into what I further intend to do, by heaven I will tear you joint from joint." "I will be gone, sir, and not trouble you," replied Balthasar; but, all the same, he intended to hide himself somewhere near, for he feared the looks of Romeo, and doubted his intention. When the serving man had retired, Romeo took up the tools, and began to wrench open the door of the tomb, but now Paris came forward to interfere. "This is that banished haughty Montague," he said to himself, "who murdered my love's cousin, out of grief for whom it is supposed she died. Now he has come here to do some villainous shame to the dead bodies. I will seize him. Stop thy unhallowed toil, vile Montague. Can vengeance be pursued further than death? Villain, I seize thee! Obey and go with me, for thou must die." "I must indeed, and therefore I came hither," said Romeo. "Good, gentle youth, do not tempt a desperate man. Fly hence and leave me; think on those who are dead. I beseech thee, youth, do not put another sin on my head by urging me to fury. Oh, begone! By heaven, I love thee better than myself. Stay not! Begone!" "I defy all thy entreaties," cried Paris hotly, "and seize thee here for a felon." "Wilt thou provoke me? Then have at thee, boy," said Romeo, compelled to draw in self defence. They fought, and Paris was wounded. "Oh, I am slain!" he moaned. "If thou be merciful, open the tomb, lay me with Juliet." "In faith I will. Let me see this face," said Romeo, and he took up the torch to look at the dead man. "Mercutio's kinsman, noble County Paris. What was it my man said when my troubled soul paid no heed to him as we rode hither? I think he told me Paris should have married Juliet. Said he not so? Or did I dream it so? Or am I mad, hearing him talk of Juliet, to think it was so? Oh, give me thy hand, one writ with me in sour misfortune's book. I'll bury thee in a triumphant grave." Taking up the dead body of the gallant youth, Romeo laid it gently inside the tomb. Then all other thoughts faded from his mind, for there, uncovered on the bier, clad in her wedding robes, radiant in all her beauty, lay the young wife from whom he had only parted a few days before. "Oh, my love, my wife!" he sighed. "Death, that hath sucked the honey of thy breath, hath had no power yet upon thy beauty. Ah, dear Juliet, why art thou yet so fair? I will stay here with thee, and never from this palace of dim night depart again. Oh, here I will set up my everlasting rest, and shake the yoke of inauspicious stars from this world-wearied flesh. Eyes, look your last; arms, take your last embrace. Here's to my love. Oh, true apothecary, thy drugs are quick. Thus, with a kiss, I die." At the further end of the churchyard, Friar Laurence, with a lantern, crowbar, and spade, was picking his way through the crowded ranks of graves when he stumbled across a friend. This was Balthasar, who told him that Romeo had gone to the Capulet's vault, but from fear of his master, did not dare accompany the friar there. Dreading some fresh misfortune, Friar Laurence hurried onwards. At the entrance to the vault he was horrified to see fresh stains of blood, and on entering it he found, to his dismay, Romeo lying there beside the bier of Juliet, and Paris newly slain. But there was no time to spare for lament or wonder; Juliet was awakening. "O comforting friar, where is my lord?" she asked, opening her sweet eyes and glancing about a little fearfully at her dreary surroundings. "I remember well where I should be, and there I am. Where is my Romeo?" At this moment a noise was heard outside. Paris's little page had warned the night watchmen of Verona, and they were now approaching. Friar Laurence implored Juliet to leave the place at once. A greater power than theirs had thwarted their plans. Her husband lay dead beside her, and Paris too was slain. The friar said he would place Juliet in safety among a sisterhood of holy nuns, only let her come at once; he dared stay no longer. "Go, get thee hence, for I will not go," replied Juliet firmly, and seeing it was useless to attempt to argue with her, Friar Laurence slipped away. Left alone, for one brief terrified moment Juliet glanced around her, but when her gaze fell on her dead husband all doubt and hesitation fled for ever. "What's here? A cup closed in my true love's hand?" she said, bending over him tenderly. "Poison, I see, has been his untimely end. O churl, drunk all, and left no friendly drop to help me follow thee? I will kiss thy lips, Haply some poison yet hangs on them." She leant forward and kissed him, and in the same moment caught sight of the dagger in Romeo's belt. "Thy lips are warm." "Lead, boy, which way?" said the voice of a watchman outside. "Yea, noise, then I'll be brief," said Juliet, snatching the dagger. "O happy dagger, this is thy sheath. There rest and let me die," and she fell back dead on Romeo's body. When the watchman, followed by the Prince of Verona and the parents of the ill-fated lovers, entered the vault, there was nothing to be done. All was over now. The joy and the sorrow, the hatred and the strife. Revenge was silenced. Henceforth the voice of dissension was mute. In the presence of those unseeing witnesses the bitter enemies were reconciled. In this palace of dim night, this dark abode of death, nothing was left now but peace and the abiding memory of undying love. End of Section 30.
Section 31 of the Shakespeare Storybook. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eva Davis. The Shakespeare Storybook by Mary Macleod. Macbeth, Part 1. The Weird Sisters. Witchcraft is now a thing of the past, as far as England is concerned, unless there still lingers in some very remote corners a belief in the power for evil of some poor old body, whose only claim for such distinction is perhaps her loneliness and ugliness. But in ancient days, and even into the last century, such a belief was a very usual thing. Wise women, as they were often called, who pretended they had the power of foretelling the future, were by no means uncommon, and even learned people and those in high positions were not ashamed to consult them with regard to coming events. In Scotland this belief lingered much longer than in England, and even to this day, in remote parts of the Highlands, there are some who claim they have the gift of second sight. That is, they can see in advance events that will happen several years hence. The time when the present story occurred was hundreds of years ago, in the year 1039, before William the Conqueror had come to Britain, and when England and Scotland were entirely separate kingdoms. The throne of Scotland was then occupied by a king called Duncan. The country at all times was much at the mercy of northern invaders, and just at that period it was suffering from the inroads of the Norwegian hosts, who, secretly aided by the traitor Thane of Cawdor, had obtained a footing in the eastern county of Fife. But their brief victory was changed to defeat by the valour of the Scotch generals, Macbeth and Banquo. Sweyn, King of Norway, was forced to sue for a truce, and had even to pay a fine of $10,000 to obtain leave to bury his men who had fallen in the fight. News was brought to King Duncan of the victory that had been gained by the valour of Macbeth, and, pronouncing the doom of instant death on the traitor Thane of Cawdor, he ordered that his title should be bestowed as a reward on Macbeth. It was a wild night, on a desolate heath near Forres. The setting sun, low down on the horizon, cast a blood-red glow over the withered bracken and a group of blasted fir trees. The thunder rolled overhead, the wind howled in long moaning gusts, the lightning flashed in jagged streaks. But to the three strange figures that approached from different quarters, and met in the centre of this lonely heath, such wild weather was of no import, or rather, it suited well with their grim and sinister mood. Children of the night, their deeds were those of darkness. The wholesome sunlight and the breath of day made them shrink and cower in secret lurking places. But when midnight veiled the sky, they stole out to their unholy revels, or on the wings of the tempest they rode forth, bringing death or disaster to all who crossed their track. "Where hast thou been, sister?" asked the first witch, and the second replied, "Killing swine." "Sister, where thou?" asked the third witch. "A sailor's wife had chestnuts in her lap, and munched, and munched, and munched," said the first witch. "Give me," quoth I, "Arrank thee, witch!" the pampered creature cried. "Her husband's to Aleppo gone, master of the tiger, but in a sieve I'll thither sail, and like a rat without a tail, I'll do, and I'll do," ended the witch spitefully. "I'll give thee a wind," said the second witch. "Thou art kind." "And I another," said the third witch. "I myself have all the other," continued the first witch, gloating over the revenge she intended to take on the husband of the woman who had repulsed her, and she continued in a sort of chant: "In the very ports they blow all the quarters that they know in the shipman's card. I will drain him dry as hay. Sleep shall neither night nor day hang upon his penthouse lid. He shall live, a man forbid. Weary 7 nights, 9 times 9, shall he dwindle, peak, and pine. Though his bark cannot be lost, yet it shall be tempest-tossed." "Look what I have." "Show me," cried the second witch eagerly. "Here I have a pilot's thumb, wrecked as homeward he did come." At this moment, across the heath, came the roll of a drum and the tramp of marching feet. "A drum, a drum, Macbeth doth come," cried the third witch. Then the 3 fearsome creatures, linking hands, solemnly performed a wild dance, waving their skinny arms in strange gestures, and uttering a discordant wail. "The weird sisters, hand in hand, posters of the sea and land, thus do go about, about, thrice to thine, and thrice to mine, and thrice again to make up 9. Peace, the charm's wound up." Macbeth and Banquo, marching across the heath on their way home, after the campaign with the Norwegians, were startled at the sight of these 3 uncanny figures barring their path. "What are these, so withered and so wild in their attire, that look not like the inhabitants of earth, and yet are on it?" said Banquo. "Are you alive, or are you anything that man may question?" "Speak, if you can. What are you?" said Macbeth. And the 3 witches answered by saluting him, each in turn. "All hail, Macbeth! Hail to thee, Thane of Glamis!" "All hail, Macbeth! Hail to thee, Thane of Cawdor!" "All hail, Macbeth! Thou shalt be king hereafter." "Good sir, why do you start, and seem to fear things that do sound so fair?" said Banquo, for Macbeth stood as if wrapped in a dream, amazed at what he heard. Then Banquo asked the witches, if indeed they could look into the future, to say something to him, who neither begged nor feared their favours nor their hate. The witches thereupon replied, "Hail, hail, hail! Lesser than Macbeth, and greater. Not so happy, yet much happier. Thou shalt beget kings, though thou be none. So all hail, Macbeth and Banquo." "Banquo and Macbeth, all hail." Macbeth would fain have questioned these mysterious creatures further, but not a word more would they speak. By the death of a relative, he was certainly Thane of Glamis, but as far as he knew, the Thane of Cawdor lived, an honourable gentleman. For Macbeth had not yet heard of his treachery, and how his title was forfeited. And to be king stood not within the prospect of belief, no more than to be Thane of Cawdor. But when Macbeth again charged the witches to speak, they vanished, seeming almost to melt like bubbles into the misty twilight from which they had emerged. The 2 victorious generals stood and looked at each other, mute for a while with awe and wonder. They had fought with armed hosts on the field of battle, but here was a mystery which might amaze the stoutest heart. The poison was already beginning to work. Deeply ambitious at heart, though lacking in resolution to cut his way ruthlessly to the highest goal, the witch's words had found a ready welcome in Macbeth's secret desires. But not yet could he openly avow them. "Your children shall be kings," he said to Banquo, and back came the answer which perhaps he was longing to hear. "You shall be king." "And Thane of Cawdor too, went it not so?" he asked, with a half-assumed air of incredulity. "To the selfsame tune and words," said Banquo. The mysterious greeting of the witches now received strange confirmation, for messengers arrived from King Duncan, bringing news that the Thane of Cawdor had been condemned to death for treason, and that his title and estate were conferred on Macbeth. Such an instant proof of the witch's powers of divination could not fail to fill Macbeth's mind with strange imaginings. "Glamis and Thane of Cawdor," he murmured to himself. "The greatest is behind." Then he spoke to Banquo apart. "Do you not hope your children shall be kings, when those that gave the Thane of Cawdor to me promised no less to them?" But Banquo's nature was less easily carried away than Macbeth's. He warned him that it was dangerous to put any trust in doers of evil. Often to win people to their harm, they would tell truth in trifles, in order to betray them in matters of the deepest consequence. Macbeth scarcely paid any attention to what Banquo said. His thoughts were fixed now on one idea. The witches had foretold truly that he should be Thane of Cawdor, when there seemed no likelihood of such an event taking place. Why, then, should they not have spoken equal truth when they foretold a higher honour? A dreadful idea was already beginning to take shape in Macbeth's mind. At first he shrank from it in horror, but again and again it came back with renewed force. At last he tried resolutely to thrust it from him. "If chance will have me king, why, chance may crown me without my stir," he said to himself. Then, with the feeling that he would leave events to work out as fate chose, he added, "Come what come may, time and the hour runs through the roughest day." But even yet he could not put the matter from him, and determined to think no more about it as a wise man would have done. He wanted to reflect over what had passed, and discuss it again with Banquo. "Let us go to the king," he said to Banquo, for the messengers had come to summon him to Duncan in order to receive his thanks for the victory. "We will think over what has chanced, and later on, having in the meanwhile pondered it, let us speak our hearts freely to each other." "Very gladly," agreed Banquo. "Till then, enough," said Macbeth. "Come, friends!" And away he went with Banquo and the other lords to receive his new honours from the king's hands. End of section 31. Section 32 of the Shakespeare Storybook. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Shakespeare Storybook by Mary Macleod. Macbeth, Part 2. At the Castle of Macbeth. King Duncan received Macbeth and Banquo most graciously, and at the same time as he conferred the new dignity on Macbeth, he took the opportunity of announcing that his own eldest son, Malcolm, should succeed himself as King of Scotland, and should be named hereafter Prince of Cumberland. In those days of strife and bloodshed, it was by no means an assured fact that the crown should descend peaceably from father to son. When the rightful heir was young or feeble, some more powerful relative often stepped forward and seized the sceptre for himself. Macbeth's wife was a near kinswoman of the king. According to some of the old chroniclers, she had even a better claim to the throne than Duncan himself. Macbeth may have been hoping that after the king's death, if it came about by natural means, the crown might pass to himself. But this public proclamation of the young prince as the heir was an obstacle in his path, which would prove a stumbling block to his ambition, unless he overleaped it. Once more, stronger than ever, rose the evil suggestion in his mind. He knew well the dark deed to which it was leading, but he was already almost determined to go through with it, cost what it might. Macbeth's character was well understood by his wife. He wished to be great, was not without ambition, but his nature was not yet sufficiently hardened to snatch what he wanted by the shortest way. The great things he wanted he would have been glad to get by rightful means. He did not wish to play falsely, but he was quite content to win wrongly. Accustomed to rely on the stern judgment of his wife, he now wrote to her a full account of the meeting with the witches, and left the matter to her firmer will to puzzle out. If there were any hesitation in Macbeth's mind, there was none at all in Lady Macbeth's. Her husband was already Thane of Glamis and Thane of Cawdor. Well, he should reach the highest honour prophesied. So resolved was she on this point, and so swift was her mind to plot evil, that when a messenger arrived to say that King Duncan was then on his way to the castle, and would be there that night, she almost betrayed the treason in her heart by the startled exclamation, "Thou art mad to say it!" It seemed as though fate itself were delivering the unsuspecting victim straight into her hands. "The raven himself is hoarse that croaks the fatal entrance of Duncan under my battlements," she muttered to herself, and with terrible decision she began to stifle all thoughts of womanly weakness or pity, and to nerve herself with unflinching cruelty for the deed that lay before her. A few minutes in advance of the king came Macbeth, and was received with the warmest greeting from his wife. "My dearest love," he said, "Duncan comes here to-night." "And when goes hence?" asked Lady Macbeth, in a voice of dreadful import. "To-morrow, as he purposes," faltered Macbeth, avoiding his wife's direct gaze. "Oh, never shall sun that morrow see," cried Lady Macbeth. "Your face, my Thane, is as a book, where men may read strange matters. To beguile the time, look like the time. Bear welcome in your hand, your eye, your tongue. Look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent under it. He who is coming must be provided for, and you shall put this night's great business into my dispatch." "We will speak further," said Macbeth, still irresolute. "Only look up clear," said Lady Macbeth. "To alter favour ever is to fear. Leave all the rest to me." The counsel Lady Macbeth gave her husband she was quite ready to carry out herself. King Duncan was welcomed with smiling courtesy, and the gentle old king was charmed by the grace and kind attention of his hostess. The castle itself was pleasantly situated, the air was fresh and sweet, and so mild that the guests of summer, the temple-haunting Martins, built in every nook and coign of vantage. In truth, everything around seemed to breathe peace and innocent security. But the hearts of the master and mistress of this castle were far from the loyalty they paraded to their royal guest, though the unbending will of Lady Macbeth was lacking to her husband. Torn with conflicting thoughts, he stole away from the chamber where King Duncan was supping, in order to ponder alone over the problem whether or not he should commit this crime. There were many reasons that cried out against it. First, Macbeth was the kinsman and subject of Duncan, both strong reasons against the deed. Then he was the host of Duncan, and as such should have barred the door against his murderer, not borne the knife himself. Duncan had shown himself so meek in his high office that all his virtues would plead in his behalf, and fill the land with horror and pity at his fate. Macbeth had no spur to urge him onward, except his vaulting ambition, which might overleap its aim and fail, after all. Missing her husband from the supper-room, Lady Macbeth followed him into the deserted hall, and when he said to her, "We will proceed no further in this business," she overwhelmed him with the bitterest contempt. She taunted him with his pitiful lack of resolution, and derided him for his cowardly want of valour. "Letting I dare not, wait upon I would, like the poor cat in the adage," as she expressed it. When Macbeth suggested that they might fail, she laughed the idea to scorn. "We fail!" she cried. "But screw your courage to the sticking place, and we'll not fail." Then she sketched out the plan of how they might proceed. When Duncan was asleep, she would drug with wine the 2 soldiers who kept watch at his door. And what then would prevent her and her husband from doing anything they liked to the unguarded king? And finally, what would prevent their laying the blame on the 2 drowsy officers, who would thus bear the guilt of the murder? Fired with admiration for his wife's undaunted courage, Macbeth made no further demur, and the murder of their guest, the king, was agreed on. The night was dark and wild, one of the roughest that had ever been known. The moon went down at 12 o'clock, and after that all was black, not a star visible. The wind moaned and wailed round the turrets of the castle. Chimneys were blown down. Strange screams were heard, which seemed to foretell coming woe. The owl, the fatal bellman of death, shrieked the livelong night. The inmates of the castle were disturbed and uneasy. It was late before they sought their rooms, for there was feasting and revelry because of the king's arrival, and then, to many of them, sleep was impossible because of the raging of the storm outside. But of what was happening in their midst they had no suspicion. At the appointed hour, Macbeth, trembling with terror at his own deed, crept into Duncan's room and killed the king. He looked so calm and peaceful as he lay there, wrapped in slumber, that sudden remorse filled the heart of the murderer, and he stood fixed in horror, gazing at what he had done. In a neighbouring room, 2 of the king's followers stirred and called out in their sleep. One laughed, and one cried, "Murder!" so that they woke each other, and Macbeth stood and heard them, but with a muttered prayer they turned again to sleep. And presently Macbeth recovered sufficiently to creep back to his wife, to tell her that the deed was done. But though he had nerved himself to strike the blow, all Macbeth's courage again ebbed away. He shuddered with horror when he looked at the blood on his hands, and it was all his wife could do to rouse him from the sort of stupor that seemed to have seized him. "These deeds must not be thought of in this way. It will make us mad," she said, when Macbeth was telling her what had happened in the chamber of the king. "Methought I heard a voice cry, 'Sleep no more,'" continued Macbeth, still in the same dazed fashion. "Macbeth doth murder sleep, the innocent sleep, balm of hurt minds, great nature's second course, chief nourisher and life's feast." "What do you mean?" interrupted his wife. "Still it cried 'Sleep no more' to all the house. Glamis hath murdered sleep, and therefore Cotter shall sleep no more. Macbeth shall sleep no more." "Who was it that thus cried?" said Lady Macbeth impatiently. "Why, worthy Thane, you weaken your strength by thinking so foolishly of things. Go, get some water, and wash this witness from your hands. Why did you bring these daggers from the place? They must lie there, and smear the sleepy grooms with blood." "I'll go no more," said Macbeth. "I am afraid to think what I have done. Look on it again I dare not." "Infirm of purpose, give me the daggers," cried Lady Macbeth contemptuously. "The sleeping and the dead are but as pictures. 'Tis the eye of childhood that fears a painted devil." And seizing the daggers from her husband's nerveless grasp, she carried them back into King Duncan's room, and placed them in the hands of the drowsy attendants, to make it appear as if it were they who had murdered the king. Before Lady Macbeth could rejoin her husband, there came a knocking at the outer gate, and she hurried him away to put on night apparel, in order to divert suspicion from themselves if they were summoned. The newcomer was a Scotch lord called Macduff, whom the king had appointed to call on him early in the morning. He was admitted into Duncan's room, when of course the crime was at once discovered. All was now horror and confusion. Macbeth feigned as much dismay as everyone else showed. The whole castle was aroused. The alarm bell pealed out. Macduff shouted for Banquo, and for the 2 young princes, Malcolm and Donalbain. Lady Macbeth came running in, as if just disturbed from sleep. Fearing what the 2 grooms might say when they recovered from their drugged sleep, Macbeth took the opportunity in the uproar to slay them both, pretending that he was carried away by the fury of the moment at seeing the evidence of their villainy, the daggers in their hands. But the suspicions of the 2 young princes were aroused. They dreaded that the treachery begun was not yet ended, and they felt no safety in their present abode. So when Macbeth summoned a meeting in the hall of the castle to decide what was to be the future course of action, they secretly stole away, for better security resolving to separate, Malcolm, the elder son, going to England, and Donalbain, the younger, to Ireland. End of section 32. Section 33 of the Shakespeare Storybook. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eva Davis. The Shakespeare Storybook by Mary Macleod. The Guest at the Banquet, The Witch's Cavern. Macbeth had all his promised honours now, king, Cador, Glamis, everything that the weird women had prophesied. But Macbeth was not satisfied. There was one danger ever present in his path. Banquo, his ancient comrade in arms, distrusted Macbeth. He suspected him of playing most foully to win his present high honours. Macbeth, for his part, feared Banquo because of his noble nature, valour, and wisdom and judgment. Outwardly he treated him with flattering civility, but inwardly he was resolved to rid himself of this dangerous companion. It was nothing to be king unless he could reign in safety. Moreover, when the Weird sisters gave the name of king to Macbeth, they had, prophet-like, hailed Banquo father to a line of kings. They placed a fruitless crown on Macbeth's head, and a barren sceptre in his grip, if no son of his succeeded. If this were so, it was for Banquo's children he had defiled his mind and murdered the good King Duncan. Only for them. Macbeth resolved to go a step further in the path of crime, and to kill both Banquo and his young son Fleance. There was to be a great feast one night at the palace. Banquo was especially invited to be present, both by Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, and he promised to be back in time for the banquet, though he had to ride out that afternoon on a matter of business. Macbeth inquired if he had to ride far, and Banquo answered that it would take all the time between then and supper. Possibly he might even have to borrow an hour or two from the darkness, unless his horse went very well. "Fail not our feast," said Macbeth. "My lord, I will not," said Banquo. "We hear our cruel cousins are bestowed in England and Ireland, not confessing their murder of their father," continued Macbeth, who now pretended to believe that King Duncan's own sons had killed him. "But more of that to-morrow. Hie ye to horse. Adieu, till you return at night." Then, in a voice of feigned carelessness, he asked Banquo if Fleance were going with him that afternoon. Banquo replied that he was, and that they ought to start at once, and with a few final words of civil farewell, Macbeth at last let him depart. Directly he had gone, Macbeth gave an order to an attendant, and two men of grim and sinister aspect were secretly ushered into his presence. These were two murderers whom he had hired to assassinate Banquo. When he had got their consent to the cruel deed, Macbeth told them that within the next hour he would instruct them where to plant themselves, and let them know the exact hour, for the deed must be done that night, and at some distance from the palace. He also gave them strict injunctions that the work was to be done thoroughly, and that the young boy Fleance was to be slain with his father, for his absence was just as material to Macbeth as was Banquo's. The murderers promised to obey his directions, and he dismissed them. If Macbeth were troubled in mind, and ill at ease, his wife was no happier. She had reached the height of her ambition. Her husband was King of Scotland, but the royal crown that glittered on her brow brought no charm with it to soothe the restless trouble at her heart. "Nought's had, all's spent. When our desire is got without content, 'tis safer to be that which we destroy, than by destruction dwell in doubtful joy." That was the secret of their misery. Macbeth and Lady Macbeth had got their heart's desire, and in the unworthy getting of it they found it brought them no content or peace of mind. Sick at heart, weary, dissatisfied, it would have been hard to find a sadder pair that day in Scotland than the King and Queen in their royal robes on the eve of their grand state banquet. But true to her old undaunted spirit, even in the midst of her own depression, Lady Macbeth tried to rouse her husband from his despondent gloom. "How now, my lord?" she said. "Why do you keep alone, making companions of sorriest fancies? Things without all remedy should be without regard. What's done is done." "We have but scotched the snake, not killed it," returned Macbeth, whose mind was always brooding on the possible dangers ahead. All day he was thinking over the past, or plotting fresh wickedness to secure his own safety, and by night he was haunted by the most terrible dreams. In this constant state of unrest he could even think with envy of the quiet repose of the man he had killed. "Better be with the dead, whom we to gain our peace have sent to peace, than to live on in the restless torture of the mind. Duncan is in his grave. After life's fitful fever he sleeps well. Treason has done its worst, nor steel nor poison, malice domestic, foreign levy, nothing can touch him further." "Come, my gentle lord," said Lady Macbeth, "smooth your rugged looks, be bright and jovial among your guests to-night." "So I shall, love, and so I pray be you," said Macbeth. "Oh, my mind is full of scorpions, dear wife. You know that Banquo and his son Fleance live." "But they will not live for ever," said Lady Macbeth. "There's comfort yet. They can be assailed," said Macbeth. And then, in dark, mysterious words, he gave his wife to understand that a deed of dreadful note was to be done that night, though he refused to tell her more precisely what it was. "Be innocent of the knowledge, dearest Chuck, till thou applaud the deed," he ended. "Thou marvellest at my words, but hold thee still. Things bad begun make themselves strong by evil." In the great hall of the palace the banquet was spread. The king and queen entered, with the thanes of Lennox and Ross and many other noblemen of Scotland. Macbeth bade them be seated, and gave to one and to all a hearty welcome. As the guests took their places at table, the arras hanging over a side doorway was pushed apart, and a grim face peered in. Leaving the stool, for there were no chairs in those days, which he was about to occupy at the side of the table, in the midst of the guests, Macbeth went to speak to the intruder. It was one of the hired assassins, and he brought the news that Banquo was safely slain. Macbeth was greatly pleased to hear this, but in another moment all his fear and discontent rushed back, for the young boy Fleance had escaped. The child of Banquo that was to be king hereafter! But Macbeth tried to console himself with the thought that, as he expressed it, the grown serpent was disposed of, and for the present at least, the young snake had no teeth to bite. Macbeth stood so wrapped in gloomy musing that Lady Macbeth was forced to recall him to a sense of his duties as host. Poor lady! She had a hard task that night. Not only had she to conceal her own unhappiness, but she had to support the flagging spirits of her husband, and try to screen his strange behaviour, while she scattered smiles and flattering words in all directions. Macbeth roused himself by fits and starts, but his gaiety was forced, and his wife dreaded that every moment he would betray himself. However, at Lady Macbeth's rebuke, he tried to shake off his gloom, and approaching the table, he made an effort to speak cheerfully to the guests. "May it please your Highness, sit," said the Thane of Lennox. The seat which Macbeth had been about to occupy when he went to speak to the murderer had remained empty, but now, unnoticed by all the other guests, a figure glided in and took possession of it. "If only Banquo were present," Macbeth went on to say, "their honour would be complete, and he hoped it was his own fault and no mischance that had kept him away." The Thane of Ross replied that Banquo deserved blame for not keeping his promise, and again asked Macbeth to favour them with his company. "The table's full," said Macbeth. "Here is a place reserved, sir," said Lennox. "Where?" "Here, my good lord," said Lennox, pointing to the seat Macbeth had first chosen. "What is it that moves your highness?" he added in alarm, for Macbeth stood gazing in horror at what seemed to the others nothing but an empty stool. Well might the guilty king tremble and grow pale, for in the place that seemed vacant to everyone else he saw sitting the blood-stained figure of the murdered Banquo. "Thou canst not say I did it! Never shake thy gory locks at me!" he cried, recoiling in horror. "Gentlemen, rise. His Highness is not well," said the Thane of Ross. But with eager words Lady Macbeth tried to calm the startled guests, assuring them that it was only a momentary fit of illness, such as Macbeth had been accustomed to from his youth. "Eat, and regard him not," she implored them. And then, in a stern undertone, she tried to rouse her husband from his fit of dazed terror. But Macbeth was heedless of her entreaties. With starting eyes, he watched the ghastly figure which his guilty brain alone could see, and it was only when the vision melted away that he recovered from the sort of stupor into which he had fallen. Then, for a brief moment, he spoke cheerfully, and, calling for wine, he drank to the health of all present. "And to our dear friend Banquo, whom we miss," he added boldly. "Would he were here! To all and him we drink." The words were scarcely uttered when once more the vision of the murdered man rose before Macbeth. With a scream of terror he again recoiled, pouring forth a torrent of entreaties and defiance. Lady Macbeth once more tried to smooth matters over, but her husband's frenzied ravings could not be so lightly covered, and dreading the suspicions that his wild words must give rise to, she hastily dismissed the guests on the plea of his sudden illness. When everyone had gone, and the husband and wife were left alone, she was too worn out and unhappy to utter any further reproaches or questions. Haggard and miserable, the guilty pair stood there in the deserted hall, amid the broken fragments of the disordered feast and the dying torches that flickered in the first grey twilight of dawn. Ashes of splendour, loneliness, despair. It seemed like the emblem of their own ruined lives. Macbeth was quiet enough now. He seemed possessed with a sort of sullen desperation. He had waded so deep in blood, it would be as tedious to go back as to go forward, and he determined that any cause that hindered his own good should be ruthlessly swept aside. It was he, not Lady Macbeth, who was the leader now. Banquo's murder he had arranged alone, and he asked no counsel from his wife about a fresh deed of iniquity he was already planning. But in his guilty superstition he resolved to go early the next day to seek the weird sisters, to learn from them, if possible, what secrets fate still held in store. The Witch's Cavern. Macbeth had gained his throne by treachery, and he had no confidence in the loyalty of his subjects. He feared lest they should plot together to bring back the sons of Duncan, and he had secret spies in the households of all the great nobles. The one he feared most, next to Banquo, was Macduff, Thane of Fife, and when the latter refused to obey the tyrant's bidding to attend the great feast, Macbeth knew that he was likely to prove a dangerous enemy, and resolved to get rid of him without delay. But before he could lay hands on him, Macduff fled the country, leaving his wife and children in his castle in Fife, and going himself to the court of the English king to beg his help in placing Malcolm on the throne. It was the day after the banquet at Macbeth's palace. In a gloomy cavern, far removed from the haunts of men, the three witches were busy brewing a hideous compound for some dark and evil purpose. In the middle of the cavern was a boiling cauldron, and as the witches circled round it in a grotesque dance, each in turn flung in some horrible ingredient. The flames crackled, Clouds of hissing steam arose from the cauldron, and as they danced, the witches croaked a discordant chant.
Double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn, and cauldron bubble.
The charm was just completed to their satisfaction, when there came a knocking at the entrance of the cavern. The second witch looked up with a cunning gleam in her sunken eyes.
By the pricking of my thumbs, something wicked this way comes. Open, locks, whoever knocks.
The door swung open by itself, and Macbeth entered. In spite of his curiosity, he stood almost appalled at the weird scene before him. The darkness of the cavern was fitfully lighted by the leaping flames of the fire, and the evil faces that peered back at him from the shadowy gloom might well bring discomfort to a guilty soul. "How now, you secret black and midnight hags? What is it you do?" he demanded.
A deed without a name,
answered the witches in chorus. "I conjure you, by that which you profess, however you come to know it, answer me to what I ask you."
Speak, demand, we'll answer,
said the witches.
Say if you would rather hear it from our mouths or from our masters.
"Call them. Let me see them." The first witch flung some additional horrible charms into the cauldron, and then the three chanted together.
Come, high or low, thyself an office deftly show.
There was a flash of light, a roll of thunder, and in the midst of a cloud of blue steam there rose from the cauldron the apparition of an armed head. "Tell me, thou unknown power," began Macbeth.
He knows thy thought,
said the first witch.
Hear his speech, but say thou not.
Macbeth, 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 beware Macduff, beware the Thane of Fife. Dismiss me. Enough. "Whate'er thou art, for thy good caution, thanks," said Macbeth, as the apparition sank from view. "Thou hast spoken my fear aright. But one word more."
He will not be commanded,
said the witch.
Here is another, more potent than the first.
There was another roll of thunder, and a second apparition arose from the cauldron, a blood-stained child. "Macbeth, Macbeth, Macbeth." "Had I 3 ears, I'd hear thee." "Be bloody, bold, and resolute. Laugh to scorn the power of man, for none of woman born shall harm Macbeth." "Then live, Macduff. What need I fear of thee?" cried Macbeth. "But yet I'll make assurance double sure. Thou shalt not live, that I may tell pale-hearted fear it lies, and sleep in spite of thunder." There was a third roll of thunder, and a third apparition rose, a child crowned with a tree in its hand. "What is this that rises like the issue of a king, and wears upon his baby brow the round of sovereignty?"
"Listen, but do not speak to it,"
commanded the witches, and the apparition spoke on. "Be lion-mettled, proud, and take no care who chafes, who frets, or where conspirers are. Macbeth shall never vanquished be until great Birnam Wood to high Dunsinane Hill shall come against him." "That will never be," cried Macbeth in delighted relief, as the vision of the baby king sank back into the cauldron. As he truly said, who could remove the forest and bid the trees unfix their earth-bound roots? All the bodements were good. Fate seemed bright before him. But there was still one thing his heart throbbed to know. "Tell me, if your art can tell so much," he begged the witches. "Shall Banquo's issue ever reign in this kingdom?"
"Seek to know no more," came the
solemn warning. "I will be satisfied. Deny me this, and an eternal curse fall on you. Let me know." Why does that cauldron sink? And what noise is that? For there was the sound of trumpets.
Show,
Show, show.
show his eyes, and grieve his heart. Come like shadows, so depart.
Then in the dusk of the cavern shone a strange luminous glow, and slowly in procession passed a line of 8 kings. The last carried a mirror in his hand, and was followed by Banquo's ghost. Horrible sight! Then, after all, the witches had spoken truly, and it was Banquo's children who should fill the throne of Scotland for untold generations. For in the mirror held by the 8th king were reflected many more, and some of them carried 2-fold orbs and treble sceptres. "What, is this so?" demanded Macbeth. And the first witch answered,
"Ay, sir, all this is so. But why stands Macbeth thus amazedly? Come, sisters, cheer we up his sprites, and show the best of our delights. I'll charm the air to give a sound, while you perform your antic round, that this great king may kindly say our duties did his welcome pay."
Then a strain of weird music was heard, and in a sort of wild mocking dance the witches vanished. The cauldron sank into the earth, and Macbeth was left standing alone in the gloomy cavern. End of section 33. Section 34 of the Shakespeare Storybook. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eva Davis. The Shakespeare Storybook by Mary Macleod. Birnam Wood. When Macbeth learnt that Macduff had escaped from his power and fled to England, he took a fiendish revenge. He gave orders that his castle in Fife should be surprised and seized, and his wife and children slain. Macbeth's barbarous commands were executed, and the Thane of Fife's wife, children, servants, and every unfortunate soul in the castle were ruthlessly slaughtered. Scotland had long been groaning under the heavy yoke of the tyrant, and at this cruel deed it broke into open rebellion. Macduff returned from England, bringing the young Prince Malcolm with him, and many noblemen flocked to their standard. Macduff, burning with revenge for the loss of all his dear ones, swore that if ever the tyrant came within reach of his sword, he should never escape alive. In the troubles that now gathered thick and fast around him, Macbeth had no longer the counsel of his devoted wife to strengthen him. The punishment of her evil deeds had fallen upon Lady Macbeth. Her stern spirit was broken, for she was a prey to all the tortures of unavailing remorse. Her sleep was troubled, and in her dreams she acted over and over again the scene that had taken place on the night of Duncan's murder. The doctor, called in to attend her, could not explain the cause of the illness that seemed consuming her, but her waiting gentlewoman told him that at night Lady Macbeth would rise in her sleep, and speak strange words, and act in a strange manner. The doctor resolved to watch himself to see what happened. For 2 nights all was quiet, but on the 3rd night, as he was speaking to the gentlewoman, Lady Macbeth entered, clad in a night-mantle, and carrying a lighted taper. Her eyes were open, but she evidently saw nothing. She was walking in her sleep. Setting down the taper, she began to rub her hands as if she were washing them, speaking the while in a low voice. From her broken phrases it was easy to guess the scene of guilt that was haunting her brain. Mixed with words about Duncan's murder came reproaches to her husband for his lack of courage, and then references to other crimes. The murder of Banquo, and the death of the Thane of Fife's wife. And all the time Lady Macbeth kept rubbing and rubbing her hands, but it was of no use. Nothing would ever make them clean again. Here's the smell of the blood still. All the perfumes of Arabia will not sweeten this little hand, she moaned, as if her heart were breaking. What a sigh is there, said the doctor. The heart is sorely charged. I would not have such a heart in my bosom for the dignity of the whole body, said the gentlewoman. This disease is beyond my practice, said the doctor. Yet I have known those that have walked in their sleep, who have died holily in their beds. Wash your hands. Put on your nightgown. Look not so pale, muttered Lady Macbeth. I tell you yet again, Banquo is buried. He cannot come out of his grave. To bed, to bed. There's knocking at the gate. Come, come. Come, come, give me your hand. What's done cannot be undone. To bed, to bed, to bed. And with a gesture, as if she were dragging some invisible person reluctantly after her, Lady Macbeth took up her taper and slowly retreated. The strain of this unceasing remorse by day and night was too much even for Lady Macbeth's dauntless courage, and the days of her life were soon to be numbered. Macbeth himself was bordering on a state of frenzy. Some said he was mad. Others who hated him less called it valiant fury. Whichever it might be, certain it was that his excitement was beyond control, and that he could not direct his cause in a reasonable manner. Sick at heart, void of all hope, he yet summoned all his courage, and resolved to fight stubbornly to the end, like some savage animal brought to bay. The English troops, led by Malcolm and Macduff, were close at hand, and the Scottish nobles with their followers were to meet them near Birnam Wood. From here the combined forces were to march on Dunsinane Castle, where Macbeth now was, and which he had strongly fortified. Rumours of the enemy's might filled the air, but Macbeth, trying to reassure himself with the witch's prophecy, bade his people bring him no more reports. Till Birnam Wood were moved to Dunsinane, I cannot quail with fear, he declared. What's the boy, Malcolm? Was he not born of woman? The spirits that know all mortal consequences have said to me thus, Fear not, Macbeth. No man that's born of woman shall e'er have power upon thee. So, when a white-faced, trembling messenger brought the news that 10,000 English soldiers were marching on Dunsinane, Macbeth silenced him with curses and abuse. But his momentary rage over, he fell again into dejection. I am sick at heart, he said. I have lived long enough. My way of life has fallen into the sere, the yellow leaf. And that which should accompany old age, such as honour, love, obedience, troops of friends, I must not look to have. But in their stead, curses, not loud but deep, mouth honour, breath, which the poor heart would fain deny, but dare not. Then, shaking off his despondency in a fresh outburst of fury, he rallied his men, determined to make a most stubborn resistance, no matter what forces were brought against him. I will not be afraid of death and bane till Birnam Forest come to Dunsinane, he cried, once more falling back for comfort on the witch's prophecy. News again came to Macbeth of the near approach of the English, and that the Scottish nobles were flocking to the standard of the young prince. But he refused to be daunted. "Hang out our banners on the outward walls," he shouted. "The cry is still, they come. Our castle's strength will laugh a siege to scorn. Here let them lie till famine and the ague eat them up." In the midst of his warlike commands, a cry of women was heard within the castle, and the news was told Macbeth that the Queen was dead. For a moment he was stunned. This, then, was the end of all their plotting and ambition. But now there was no time even to spend in grief. She should have died hereafter, he said, with a bitter reflection on the vanity of human life. There would have been time for such a word. Tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day, to the last syllable of recorded time, and all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle! Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. But his musing was interrupted. A messenger came hurrying up, his face full of terror. "Thou comest to use thy tongue, thy story quickly." The man sank on his knee before Macbeth. "Gracious my lord, I should report that which I say I saw, but know not how to do it." "Well, say, sir," said Macbeth impatiently. "As I stood watching upon the hill, I looked toward Burnham, and anon, methought, the wood began to move." "Liar and slave!" cried Macbeth, livid with fury, and striking the man to the ground. "Let me endure your wrath if it be not so," persisted the messenger. "Within these 3 miles you may see it coming. I say, a moving grove." "If thou speak false, upon the next tree shalt thou hang alive till famine cling thee," said Macbeth. "If thy speech be true, I care not if thou dost as much for me." His resolution faltered, and he began to doubt the falseness of the fiends that lied like truth. "Fear not till Burnham Wood do come to Dunsinane," they had said. And now a wood was coming to Dunsinane. "Arm, arm, and out!" thundered Macbeth. If this which he avouches be true, there is no flying hence, nor tarrying here, he thought, sick at heart. I begin to be aweary of the sun, and wish the estate of the world were now undone. Then, with a sudden return of fury, "Ring the alarm bell, blow, wind, come, rack. At least we'll die with harness on our back." The strange occurrence reported by the messenger was indeed true, but the explanation was simple. When the English and Scotch troops met near Burnham Wood, in order the better to conceal the soldiers as they marched to Dunsinane, Malcolm commanded that every man should hew down a leafy bough and bear it before him, thereby making it impossible that the number of their host could be discovered. From a distance this mass of waving green boughs looked exactly as if Burnham Wood were advancing on Dunsinane. The first of the witch's safeguards had failed Macbeth, but he fell back with desperate reliance on the other. Besides, in any case, it was now too late to retreat. He must fight the matter out to the end, and either conquer or be lost forever. "They have tied me to a stake," he cried. "I cannot fly, but bear-like I must fight the course. What's he that was not born of woman? Such a one am I to fear, or none." In his furious fighting on the battlefield, he presently encountered one of the English leaders, whom he promptly slew. Macbeth laughed in triumph, for he felt himself secure. He feared no weapon brandished by any man born of woman. But the hour of fate was at hand. Macduff, scorning to strike the wretched peasants hired to fight, sought everywhere for Macbeth, determined either to slay the tyrant or sheathe his sword unused. And at last he found him. But Macbeth seemed to shrink from the furious challenge. "Of all men else I have avoided thee," he said, "but get thee back. My soul is too much charged with blood of thine already." "I have no words. My voice is in my sword," returned Macduff. They fought, but for a while neither got the better. Then Macbeth told Macduff that he was losing labour, for it was as easy for his keen sword to hurt the air as to wound him. He bore a charmed life, which could not yield to one of woman born. "Despair thy charm," cried Macduff, and the next moment Macbeth knew that the witches had doubly deceived him, for his second hope had failed. Macduff proclaimed that his birth had been different from that of ordinary mortals, so that, in a way, he might be said never to have been born. "Accursed be the tongue that tells me so," exclaimed Macbeth, "for it hath cowed my better part of man. And be those juggling fiends no more believed, that palter with us in a double sense, that keep the word of promise to the ear, and break it to our hope. I'll not fight with thee." "Then yield thee, coward," taunted Macduff, "and live to be the show and gaze of the time. We'll have thee, as our rarer monsters are, painted upon a pole, and underwrit, 'Here you may see the tyrant.'" His words goaded Macbeth's failing nerve to fresh fury. Desperate and despairing, he flung his final challenge at his foe. "I will not yield to kiss the ground before young Malcolm's feet, and to be baited with the rabble's curse. Though Birnam Wood be come to Dunsinane, and thou opposed, being of no woman born, yet I will try the last. Before my body I throw my warlike shield. Lay on, Macduff, and cursed be him that first cries, 'Hold, enough.'" The fight was over, and as the victorious generals gathered on the field of battle, with drums beating and flags flying, Macduff approached, bearing the head of the slain Macbeth, and saluted the young Prince Malcolm as King of Scotland. "Hail, King, for so thou art. Behold where stands the usurper's cursed head. The land is free. Hail, King of Scotland." And the trumpets sounded, and a universal shout rent the air. "Hail, King of Scotland." End of section 34.